I think we can all agree that the Holy Bible is a hot mess of a book that no one should structure their lives around. And if you disagree with that statement, then it's pretty obvious that you're either a liar, a lunatic, or lord of the people who've never read the book. Now, just a couple disclaimers before we launch into our list of inconvenient verses. It is our stance here at the B.S. Lewis channel that there are as many versions of Christianity as there are individual Christians. That being said, Christians may disagree with my stance on one verse and completely agree with me on another. I'd like to emphasize, while these verses may highlight textual contradictions or moral failings of the book, that is not my focus here. My focus with these inconveniences is to highlight theological frictions within established Christian doctrines such as salvation, eschatology, or the character of God. And finally, in an attempt to be as fair as possible, all the verses featured today have been taken from books that are written in a narrative style. No artsy-fartsy genres like poetry or apocalyptic literature. So a literal, straightforward reading is recommended. None of these apologetic, interpretive tricks such as hyperbole or metaphor or allegory, or any of these other desperate attempts that Christians use to get the words on the page to mean something other than it clearly says.
Moving the goalposts now.
I think that's enough for the disclaimers. Let's get into this.
Repentance, Exodus 9:12. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses.
This is a pretty popular verse for the free will versus determinism debate, but it's so much worse for Christian theology when you just dig a little deeper. For proper context, this happens during the 10 plagues of Egypt story, specifically the 6th plague of boils that afflicts the Egyptians. For the first 5 plagues, the text says Pharaoh hardened his own heart, which is just another way of saying he was stubborn. But for the next 5 plagues, it specifically says that God caused Pharaoh's hardened heart, except perhaps the 7th plague of hail. Now, a lot of Christians like to use the excuse that God only hardened Pharaoh's heart because Pharaoh had already hardened it himself. And this has got to be one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. I invite you to use your brain for just 1 second to think logically about this and see why. If Pharaoh is going to continue to be stubborn for the second half of the plagues, why would God need to harden his heart? The answer is obvious. He wouldn't. Pharaoh was going to repent. Pharaoh was going to let the Israelites go by the 6th plague. But God encroached on his free will to change his mind and course of action despite the unnecessary suffering it would cause. Because it was never about freeing the Israelites or correcting Pharaoh's behavior. It was always about God's tremendous ego in making an example out of Egypt to the surrounding nations by slaughtering their firstborn children. And if you doubt my analysis here, well, then you're just wrong. Because God himself clearly outlined his plan in Exodus 4:21, before Moses even stepped foot in Egypt.
Biblical marriage, 2 Samuel 12:8. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah, and if all of this had been too little, I would have given you even more.
Somewhere along the line, modern Christians got it in their heads that a biblical marriage involves only one man and one woman. But did you know that the majority of married people mentioned in the Bible were actually polygamous? Yeah, true story. So I don't have any idea where they get this exclusive monogamous model from. Christians usually say that God allowed polygamy, but it wasn't what he wanted, and it usually ended in disastrous results. But you tell me, could those relationships possibly be any more disastrous than the first monogamous relationship? Despite the verses in the Old Testament that both condone and regulate polygamy seen here, the verse in 2 Samuel shows that God had no problem at all with polygamy, considering he not only gave David another man's multiple wives, but he was willing to give him more if David had wanted them. Now you might be thinking, sure, God may have condoned and regulated polygamy in his law, and given David multiple wives, and offered him more. But that doesn't mean he wanted any of that. And if you're thinking that, you just be a moron who's ignorant of your own religion.
Stupid! You're so stupid!
Because 1 Kings 15:5 is pretty clear that David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord and had not failed to keep any of God's commands his whole life except having multiple wives. Wait, no, that's not right. Except committing adultery with Bathsheba and having her husband killed. I think it's pretty telling how the man after God's own heart didn't catch any grief from the big guy upstairs for his harem.
Satan, Job 2:3. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason."
This verse is a doozy because it challenges two aspects of the common Christian understanding of God's arch nemesis, namely his abilities and his role. The context here is that Satan and God had struck a wager. God bet Satan that he couldn't get his servant Job to curse God by slaughtering all his livestock, servants, and children. The verse we're focusing on today happens after those events, but before God gives Satan permission to harm Job's own body. Now all the hubbub surrounding this statement is at the end of the verse, where God says to Satan, "Though you have incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." Upon a plain reading of the text, it's clear that "you incited me" demonstrates that it was Satan's will using God's power to wreak havoc on Job's life. The "without any reason" at the end just reinforces that God had no motivation to carry out the attack. Now, you might be thinking I'm missing the obvious at this point. God didn't attack Job, he merely lifted his hedge of protection. It does allude to this in the previous chapter, after all. You would, of course, be an incorrect idiot if you thought that.
Stop it. Get some help.
Because you wouldn't be considering the methods of execution of the victims if you said that. Job chapter 1 verse 16 clearly states that the fire of God, not the fire of Satan, came from the heavens to burn the sheep and servants. And in the same chapter in verse 19, it says a great wind collapsed the house on Job's children. If we fast forward to Psalm 135 verse 7, it explicitly states that God alone is in control of the winds that killed Job's children. So, there's no actual way we can pin these murders on Satan. At best, he's an accomplice guilty of second-degree manslaughter. And as a special bonus, this verse adds an extra scoop of clusterfuck on top of the area of Christology. The fact that God can lease his powers out to anyone, including Satan, means that no one can use miracles, including the resurrection, to determine that the identity of Jesus Christ is God, and not actually some good or evil representative borrowing God's power. Unless, that is, you're willing to accept Satan as part of the Godhead.
Covenants, Jeremiah 27. You deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me.
If there's one thing Christians can depend on, it has to be the honest truthiness of the prophets that serve as the mouthpiece of God. But what happens when one of those prophets calls God a liar? Well, that's when we have a paradox of biblical proportions. Especially when you have another prophet named Balaam speaking on behalf of God, specifically saying that God doesn't lie. Let's check out Numbers 23 verse 19, shall we? Is God/Balaam telling the truth here? Well, let's go through the rest of the verse. God doesn't change his mind, you say? Well, that's just not true. God regrets making humanity here. God repents from destroying Israel here. And God regretted making Saul king here. So, on face value, yeah, that does look like a lie. But hey, maybe that's just a fluke. Let's see what the next line says. Does he speak and not act? Well, yeah, sure. I mean, that's basically the whole story of Jonah, right? That's why Jonah, another prophet by the way, got so mad. He knew that God wasn't going to follow through on his promise to destroy Nineveh in 40 days. Well, that looks like another false statement by Balaam speaking on behalf of God. What about the last line? Does God make promises he doesn't fulfill? Well, that is the million-dollar question now, isn't it? Is God the liar, or the prophets he chose to speak for him?
Failed prophecy. Matthew 24:34. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened.
The motif of this verse is really similar to the last one, namely that like his daddy / himself, Jesus is a liar, liar, tunic on fire. One of the main differences is that in the Jesus story he's supposed to be demonstrating his identity as God / the Messiah, using magic tricks, cryptic teachings, and, you guessed it, fulfilled prophecy. All the things that must happen before the generation he's talking to passes takes up pretty much the whole chapter. So this section may be a little bit longer than the previous ones, but just stick with me. I'll try to get through the list quickly. But there is one thing I want you to keep in mind. That according to Numbers 32:13, a biblical generation is described as 40 years. That's how long God made the Israelites wander around the desert to die off before the next generation could enter the Promised Land. That would put us at about 70 AD-ish to accomplish all that stuff. So let's get into it. False messiahs.
For many will come in my name, claiming, I am the Messiah, and will deceive many.
Well, yeah. Given certain prophecies in the book of Daniel, people claiming to be the Jewish Messiah around this time were a dime a dozen.
Jesus was way cool.
Wars and rumors of wars.
You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come.
Yeah, duh.
Jesus was way cool.
Unrest between nations and kingdoms?
Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom.
Again, yes, a pretty common occurrence.
Jesus was way cool.
Famines and earthquakes in various places.
There will be famines and earthquakes in various places.
I don't know all the details about this, but I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that an earthquake or two would happen someplace on Earth within 40 years.
Jesus was way cool.
His apostles will be persecuted, put to death, and hated by all nations because of him.
Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me.
Finally, a prophecy with some substance. The persecution of the apostles is a complicated topic that would take a whole video in itself to cover. But ultimately, I'd have to say that this is our first fail of the list, because it's demonstrably false that all of the nations hated the apostles. They didn't even know who Jesus was by 70 AD.
They weren't doing this in 70 AD.
People will betray the faith and each other.
At that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other.
Okay, I'll give it to him just because it's such a nothing burger.
Jesus was way cool.
False prophets will deceive people.
And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people.
I guess. I don't believe in prophets, but Jesus can have this because I don't really see a way to verify it.
Jesus was way cool.
People will stop loving each other.
Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold.
Okay, whatever.
Jesus was way cool.
Here we go, finally a good one. The gospel will be preached to all nations.
And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come.
That's a big nuh-uh. Just like hating the apostles, the whole world definitely didn't know the gospel by 70 AD.
They weren't doing this in 70 AD.
The abomination of desolation.
So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel.
This is another rather complicated topic that is already based off of a highly metaphorical writing in the book of Daniel. Religious folks have argued about the meaning of this for centuries and offered up many different interpretations.
And I knock on her door and I say, Carol! Carol, I gotta talk to you about Pepe. And when I open the door, what do I find? There's not a single goddamn desk in that office. There is no Carol in HR.
So I'm just gonna leave this one inconclusive.
B.S. Lewis was way cool in 70 AD, which is just stating a fact.
Greater distress than any since the beginning of the world.
For there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again.
Well, as far as I'm aware, there wasn't any global flood around 70 AD, so we're gonna have to give Jesus another fail here.
They weren't doing this in 70 AD.
The sun and moon will be darkened, and the stars will fall from the sky.
Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken.
Looks like that's another big fail for Jesus. It appears the earth is still here and hasn't been crushed by a star. And Christian, if you're going to tell me that this is some kind of metaphor or something, and then say in the same breath that the sun being darkened is a literal thing that literally happened because it's written in your literature, you're literally a dumbass.
They weren't doing this in 70 AD.
They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven.
Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, with power and great glory.
And this is a big fail that nearly every Christian can agree with, because they're still waiting on his return nearly 2,000 years later.
They weren't doing this in 70 AD.
So yeah, that's the list. And our conclusion? It's not too different than our last point. Is Jesus a lying prophet or a lying God?
You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord, if what a prophet claims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true? That is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously, so do not be alarmed.